In the late morning of April 2nd, 2014, the river that flowed quietly through the outskirts of Tongren City looked no different than it did on any other dry season day. The Tuanjiang River, narrower and calmer this time of year, moved slowly between shallow banks of exposed earth and stone. For the few villagers who lived along its edges, the river was simply part of daily life. Some used it to wash clothes. Others crossed it by small wooden boats to reach nearby farmland or neighboring villages. That morning, an elderly ferryman named Wu had already made several trips carrying passengers across the water. At 60 years old, this routine had become second nature to him. The current was gentle, the sky was pale with the quiet stillness of midday approaching, and his final trip before lunch was nearly complete. As he guided the small boat across the river, something unusual caught his attention. Not far ahead, drifting slowly with the current, was a bulky object floating near the surface of the water. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than discarded furniture, perhaps a sofa or cushion someone had thrown away upstream. It wasn't uncommon for trash to end up in the river, especially during the dry season when the water level dropped and debris became easier to spot. The object had a pale orange color and a slightly curved shape, which made it resemble a large piece of foam padding or fabric. But as the boat moved closer, the ferryman began to feel an uneasy sense that something wasn't right. The shape looked wrong, too rigid in some places, too uneven in others. The color also seemed unusual. It wasn't the faded orange of old fabric or foam, but something brighter, like the color of a plastic sack. Curious and slightly concerned, the ferryman slowly steered the boat toward it, leaning forward to take a better look. The object drifted gently in the water, rocking with the small waves created by his boat. And then he saw it. What had looked like a floating piece of trash was not trash at all. It was a human body. For a brief moment, the ferryman froze in shock, his hands still gripping the wooden oar. The body was partially wrapped inside a large orange sack, the kind commonly used to store fertilizer. Rope had been tied tightly around the upper portion of the sack, securing it around the head and torso. Even from a short distance away, the unnatural stillness of the body was unmistakable. The shape beneath the sack was unmistakably human. The body had begun to swell after spending time in the water, drifting slowly near the surface, while the current carried it toward the shallower edge of the riverbank. The ferryman stared at the sight in disbelief, struggling to process what he was seeing. In a place where daily life moves slowly and predictably, discovering something like this felt almost unreal. After several long seconds, he regained his composure and immediately turned the boat back toward the shore. Once on land, he quickly contacted the local authorities. Within a short time, police officers and forensic investigators arrived at the scene. The atmosphere along the quiet stretch of river changed instantly. Investigators carefully moved the body from the water onto the muddy bank. Even before the sack was removed, the scene already suggested something far more disturbing than an accidental death. The rope bindings were tight and deliberate. Whoever had wrapped the body had clearly intended to keep the sack firmly in place. As forensic officers began to examine the remains more closely, another detail became visible. Attached to the body with a length of brown rope was a heavy concrete brick with two hollow holes running through its center. The rope had been threaded through those holes before being secured around the body, creating a crude but effective weight designed to pull the corpse down beneath the water. Whoever had done this had clearly tried to make sure the body would never be discovered, but the river had other plans. As investigators carefully removed the rope and loosened the sack, a grim reality began to emerge. Inside was the body of a young woman, likely somewhere in her early 20s. The effects of time in the water had made identification difficult, but the signs of violence were immediately apparent. There were visible wounds across her chest and neck, injuries that suggested she had been attacked with a sharp weapon. Yet the most shocking discovery came moments later. As forensic examiners studied the body more closely, they noticed something unusual about the woman's abdomen. Even accounting for the swelling caused by water exposure, her stomach appeared unusually large. After conducting a preliminary examination, investigators reached a heartbreaking conclusion. The young woman had been pregnant. Further analysis would later confirm that the pregnancy had progressed to approximately 7 months. The unborn child inside her had already turned into the head-down position, typical in the final months before birth. In other words, 2 lives had been lost. The discovery instantly transformed what might have been a simple homicide investigation into something far more disturbing. Not only had someone killed this woman, but they had done so knowing she was carrying a child. The question that now faced investigators was painfully simple, yet incredibly difficult to answer. Who was she? At the scene, there were no identification documents, no phone, no wallet, nothing that could immediately reveal her identity. The riverbank where she had been found was quiet and remote, and based on the condition of the body, investigators estimated that death had occurred roughly 2 weeks earlier, which meant that somewhere for nearly half a month, a pregnant woman had vanished without a trace, and no one had come looking for her. For the police in Tongren, this raised an unsettling possibility. If no missing person report had been filed, it meant that the woman might have been living a life largely invisible to those around her. A life that left few records, few connections, and perhaps many secrets. As officers began their investigation, they also studied the river itself. The Tuanjiang's water levels during the dry season were relatively stable, and currents moved slowly. Based on environmental conditions and the estimated time of death, investigators concluded that the body likely entered the river somewhere upstream, no more than 3 to 5 kilometers away, which meant the killer had probably been nearby. Someone in Tongren had murdered a young pregnant woman, wrapped her body inside a fertilizer sack, tied a concrete brick to it, and thrown her into the river believing it would disappear forever. But now the river had given her back. And with her return came a mystery that would soon reveal a tangled web of relationships, deception, and a tragedy far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. For investigators in Tongren, the first and most urgent question was also the most basic one. Before they could understand why the young woman had been killed, they needed to know who she was. Without a name, there was no history to examine, no relationships to investigate, and no clear direction for the case. The river had returned a body, but it had offered no answers. At the scene, the victim carried no identification. There was no phone, no bank card, no personal belongings that could reveal even the smallest detail about her identity. The body itself had been in the water for nearly 2 weeks, according to the forensic estimate based on decomposition in the condition of the skin. That meant she had likely died sometime around the middle of March, long before the ferryman discovered her drifting in the current. In many homicide investigations, the victim's family eventually comes forward after a disappearance is reported. But in this case, the days that followed brought an unsettling silence. No missing person report immediately matched the description of a pregnant woman in her 20s. No relatives contacted police searching for someone who had suddenly vanished. It was as if the victim had disappeared from the world without anyone noticing. Faced with this uncertainty, investigators turned to forensic identification. DNA samples were collected from the victim and submitted into China's National DNA Database, a system that stores genetic information collected during previous criminal investigations. In many cases, individuals who had been arrested or involved in certain legal matters had their DNA recorded as part of the process. If the victim had ever come into contact with law enforcement before, there was a chance her identity might still be hidden somewhere inside that database. When the results returned, investigators finally had their answer. The victim's name was Wu Quan. The match came quickly because Wu Quan's DNA had already been recorded several years earlier during a criminal investigation in another province. That case had not been violent, but it had involved something equally complicated: a marriage fraud scheme. According to police records from Nantong in Jiangsu province, Wu Quan had once deceived a man by promising marriage in exchange for a large dowry payment. After receiving approximately 80,000 yuan, she disappeared. Because the case had been investigated formally, her DNA had been collected and stored in the national system. Ironically, it was that same record that now allowed investigators in Tongren to identify her body within hours. But learning her name only opened the door to a much deeper story. Police soon contacted Wu Quan's registered family address in Tongren. The home they found was a small wooden house in a rural village, modest and worn by years of poverty. Inside lived her older brother, who had not heard from her in some time. When officers told him about the body found in the river, the news confirmed a fear that had been quietly growing. Wu Quan's life, it turned out, had never been stable. According to her brother, their mother had died when Wu Quan was only 9 years old. After that, the family struggled to survive. Their father was known to have a quick temper, and arguments inside the household were frequent. When Wu Quan reached 16, a particularly violent confrontation ended with her leaving home entirely. She walked away from the village and never truly returned. From that point forward, her life became increasingly disconnected from her family. She moved from place to place, taking temporary work and forming relationships with different men. Communication with her relatives was rare. Even when their father later passed away, Wu Quan did not come home for the funeral. In the years that followed, her brother could only hear occasional rumors about where she might be living. Those rumors painted the picture of a woman whose life had become complicated and unstable. By her late teens, Wu Quan was already involved in multiple romantic relationships at the same time. At one point, she had been dating 2 men simultaneously, eventually giving birth to a daughter with one of them. The relationship ended soon afterward, and the child was left in the care of the father. But Wu Quan's pattern of relationships did not change. Instead, it seemed to become a defining part of her lifestyle. She drifted between partners, sometimes living with them, sometimes disappearing for days or weeks at a time. According to those who had known her, she often relied on the financial support of the men she dated. Some described her as charming and persuasive. Others saw her as unpredictable and secretive. By the time investigators reconstructed her recent history, they realized Wu Quan had been involved with several men at once, each believing they were the most important person in her life. And that web of relationships was about to become the center of the investigation. One of those men was a taxi driver in Tongren named Tang Tao. According to early information, Wu Quan had been living with him for nearly a year before her death. Tang Tao had even introduced her to his family as his partner, and they had been preparing for the birth of the child she was carrying. But Tang Tao was not the only man connected to her. Investigators also discovered another relationship that complicated the situation even further. Around the same time she had been living with Tang Tao, Wu Quan had been communicating online with a younger man named Wang Shudan. Their conversations had eventually turned into a romantic relationship, and not long before her death, the two had even held a wedding ceremony in front of Wang's family. What made the situation almost impossible to understand was the timeline. The wedding with Wang Shudan had taken place on March 8, 2014. Just 1 week later, Wu Quan would be dead. And somehow, during that same period, she had continued living with Tang Tao as if nothing had changed. To investigators, this created a troubling possibility. Wu Quan had not simply been involved in a love triangle. Instead, she appeared to be moving between different relationships, maintaining separate lives with different men who knew little about each other. That kind of deception had the potential to create powerful emotions: anger, jealousy, betrayal. Any one of those emotions could become a motive for murder. As detectives continued to trace Wu Quan's final weeks, one fact became clear. In the months leading up to her death, she had been living in a delicate balance of secrets and lies. Each relationship depended on the others remaining hidden. But secrets like that rarely stay hidden forever. And somewhere within that complicated web of relationships was the person who had wrapped her body in a fertilizer sack, tied it with rope, and thrown her into the dark water of the Tuanzhang River. The only question left was which of the men in her life had finally discovered the truth. Once investigators confirmed the identity of the victim as Wu Quan, the direction of the case became much clearer. Her life in the years leading up to her death had been filled with unstable relationships, financial dependence on partners, and a pattern of deception that often left people feeling betrayed. But among all the men connected to her, 2 names quickly stood out. They were the last people known to have had close relationships with her before she disappeared. The first man was Tang Tao, a local taxi driver in Tongren. In many ways, Tang Tao appeared to be the most stable person in Wu Quan's life at the time. According to neighbors and relatives, the two had been living together for nearly a year. Tang Tao was in his early 30s, quiet and hardworking, someone who spent long hours driving passengers through the city streets. To outsiders, he seemed like an ordinary man trying to build a simple life. When investigators first spoke with Tang Tao, he appeared cooperative. He admitted that Wu Quan had been living with him and confirmed that she had been pregnant. According to him, he believed the child was his. In fact, he had already begun preparing for the baby's arrival. Tang Tao told police that Wu Quan had moved into his apartment sometime in 2013 after they began dating. Over time, their relationship became more serious, and he had even introduced her to members of his family. When she later told him she was pregnant, he accepted the news without question. To him, it meant that they would soon become a family. Neighbors remembered seeing Wu Quan frequently entering and leaving Tang Tao's apartment building. She often wore loose clothing that made her pregnancy noticeable in the later months. Tang Tao would sometimes drive her to local clinics for prenatal checkups, and several people described the couple as appearing relatively normal. But that normal image only existed on the surface, because while Tang Tao believed he was preparing for fatherhood, Wu Quan had already started another relationship behind his back. The second man was Wang Shudan, a younger man from another city who had met Wu Quan online. Their relationship began through casual messaging, but over time, their conversations became more personal. Wu Quan told him that she was single, and the two eventually developed romantic feelings for each other. At first, their communication existed mostly through the internet and phone calls, but eventually they began meeting in person. According to Wang Shudan's later statements, Wu Quan had presented herself as someone looking for stability in marriage. She spoke about wanting to settle down and start a family. Her words convinced Wang Shudan that she was sincere, and he soon introduced her to his parents. The relationship moved forward quickly. In early March 2014, Wang Shudan's family organized a small wedding ceremony in their hometown. It wasn't a large or extravagant event, but it followed traditional customs. Relatives gathered, gifts were exchanged, and the couple formally presented themselves as husband and wife. The date of the ceremony was March 8, 2014. Photographs from that day later showed Wu Quan smiling in a red dress, standing beside Wang Shudan while relatives congratulated them. To his family, the event marked the beginning of a new marriage. What they did not know was that Wu Quan had been living with another man just days earlier. Even more shocking was the fact that by March 8th, her pregnancy was already about 7 months along. The swollen abdomen could not easily be hidden, yet Wu Quan reportedly told Wang Shudan's family that the child had been conceived during their relationship. For a brief period, it seemed that she had successfully maintained two separate lives. With Tang Tao, she was a pregnant partner preparing for the birth of their child. With Wang Shudan, she was a newly married wife beginning a new future. But the delicate balance of lies could only last so long. Investigators studying phone records soon discovered that in the days following the wedding ceremony, Wu Quan had continued communicating with both men. Messages were exchanged, phone calls were made, and her movements became increasingly difficult to track. Then, sometime around March 17th, the contact suddenly stopped. Wu Quan disappeared. Neither Tang Tao nor Wang Shudan initially reported her missing, which investigators found unusual, but the reasons behind that silence were complicated. Both men seemed to believe she had simply gone somewhere temporarily. Tang Tao told police that Wu Quan had occasionally left home for short periods without explaining where she was going. Because of her unpredictable lifestyle, he assumed she would eventually return. Wang Shudan, on the other hand, believed that after the wedding she had gone back to Tongren, briefly to settle personal matters before returning to live with him permanently. In other words, each man believed she was with the other. This misunderstanding created a gap of nearly 2 weeks during which Wu Quan's disappearance went unnoticed. By the time the ferryman discovered her body in the river on April 2nd, the truth had already been hidden for half a month. For investigators, the situation now became intensely suspicious. Two men were deeply connected to the victim. Both had strong emotional relationships with her. Both had reasons to feel betrayed if they discovered the truth about her double life. But which one had learned the secret first? And more importantly, which one had reacted with violence? To answer that question, detectives began reconstructing Wu Quan's final days, examining phone records, tracking her movements, and interviewing everyone who had seen her shortly before she vanished. What they discovered would soon point directly toward one of the men, and the truth behind the murder would prove even darker than anyone expected. With the identities of the two key men established, investigators began carefully examining the timeline of Wu Quan's final days. Both Tang Tao and Wang Shudan had strong emotional connections to her, but the nature of those relationships was very different. One believed he was about to become a father. The other believed he had just married the woman who would become his wife. But as detectives reconstructed the events of March 2014, Small details began to expose cracks in the story. The first breakthrough came through phone records. Investigators obtained the call history and messaging data from Wu Quan's phone number. Although her phone had never been recovered from the river, the telecommunications records still preserved a clear picture of who she had been communicating with before her disappearance. By mapping out the frequency of calls and messages, police could see exactly which relationships had been most active in the days leading up to her death. Two names appeared repeatedly, Tang Tao and Wang Shudan. But what surprised investigators was the pattern of the calls. After the wedding ceremony on March 8th, Wu Quan had continued to contact Tang Tao almost daily. Their conversations were not short or casual. Some calls lasted more than 20 minutes, suggesting they were discussing personal matters. This raised an obvious question. If Wu Quan had truly married Wang Shudan on March 8th, why was she still maintaining such close communication with Tang Tao afterward? The phone records also revealed something else. The last confirmed call Wu Quan ever made occurred on the evening of March 17th. The call lasted just a few minutes and was placed to Tang Tao. After that moment, her phone activity stopped completely. No more messages, no more calls, no more movement detected by cell towers. It was as if her life had suddenly gone silent. That detail immediately drew the attention of investigators. If Tang Tao was the last person to speak with her, he might also have been the last person to see her alive. Police decided to question him again. During the second interview, Tang Tao appeared noticeably more nervous than he had during their first conversation. At first, he repeated the same explanation he had given before. He claimed that Wu Quan sometimes left home without warning and that he had assumed she would eventually return. But when detectives asked about the phone call on March 17th, his answers began to shift. He admitted that they had spoken that evening. According to him, Wu Quan had told him she needed to go out to meet someone. After that, he said, she never came back. The explanation sounded possible, but it didn't fully satisfy investigators, so they began checking additional evidence. One of the most important pieces of information came from surveillance cameras near Tang Tao's apartment building. Although the cameras did not capture every entrance or exit clearly, they did provide partial footage of people coming and going from the area during the relevant time period. When investigators reviewed the recordings from March 17, they noticed something interesting. Wu Quan was seen entering Tang Tao's apartment building that evening, but she was never seen leaving. The footage wasn't perfect. There were blind spots and gaps. But the absence of any record of her departure immediately raised serious suspicion. If she had truly gone out after the phone call, there should have been at least some evidence of her leaving the building. Instead, the cameras only showed Tang Tao leaving the apartment complex later that night, driving his taxi toward the outskirts of the city. For detectives, the pattern was beginning to look less like coincidence and more like a potential cover story. The investigation now shifted toward Tang Tao's movements during the late hours of March 17th. Taxi dispatch records showed that after leaving the apartment, Tang Tao had not accepted any passenger fares for several hours. For a driver who normally spent long nights working to earn money, this was unusual. His taxi had been moving, but it wasn't following the typical routes used to pick up customers. GPS data later confirmed that his vehicle had traveled toward a quieter area along the upper section of the Tuanjiang River, not far from where the body would eventually be discovered weeks later. The timing matched almost perfectly with the estimated window during which the body had likely been placed in the water. Investigators now had several troubling facts aligned in the same direction. Wu Quan had entered Tang Tao's apartment on March 17th. She was never seen leaving. Her final phone call was to him, and later that night, his taxi traveled toward the same river where her body was eventually found, weighted down with a concrete brick. The evidence was still circumstantial, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, detectives also interviewed Wang Shudan to determine whether he could have been involved. His statements painted a very different picture. According to him, after the wedding on March 8th, Wu Quan had told him she needed to return briefly to Tongren to settle personal matters before moving permanently to live with him. He claimed that after she left, their contact gradually became less frequent. The last time he heard from her was several days before March 17th. At the time, he believed she was simply busy handling personal issues. More importantly, investigators were able to verify his location through multiple witnesses and travel records. During the critical period surrounding March 17th, Wang Shudan had been staying with relatives in another city several hundred kilometers away. That information effectively removed him from the list of primary suspects. All attention now turned toward Tang Tao. When detectives compared the forensic evidence from the river with the materials found in his apartment and taxi, they discovered additional similarities. The type of rope used to bind the sack around the victim was identical to rope found in his storage area. The orange fertilizer sack also matched the kind commonly used by small farmers in the region, a type that Tang Tao had access to through relatives who worked in agriculture. Piece by piece, the evidence began forming a single disturbing picture. Investigators now believed that Wu Quan had died inside Tang Tao's apartment sometime on the night of March 17th. Afterward, her body had been wrapped, weighted down, transported by taxi, and thrown into the river in an attempt to hide the crime forever. But one crucial question still remained unanswered. Why? What could have happened inside that apartment that night that was violent enough to end the life of a pregnant woman and her unborn child? The answer would only emerge when Tang Tao finally broke his silence. By the time investigators brought Tang Tao in for another round of questioning, the pressure surrounding him had already begun to build. What had started as a routine interview had gradually turned into something far more serious. Piece by piece, the evidence had begun closing in on him. The timeline no longer worked in his favor. Wu Quan had entered his apartment building on the evening of March 17th. She had not been seen leaving. Her final phone call had been with him. Later that same night, his taxi had traveled toward the upper stretch of the Tuanjiang River, where her body would eventually be discovered weeks later. At first, Tang Tao tried to remain calm. Inside the interrogation room, he repeated the same story he had told before. Wu Quan had left his apartment after their conversation, he insisted. He didn't know where she had gone, and he hadn't heard from her since. But investigators had already gathered too much information. They began confronting him with specific details: surveillance footage from the apartment building, the phone records showing he was the last person to speak with her, the GPS data from his taxi placing him near the river during the late hours of that same night. With every new piece of evidence presented, Tang Tao's answers became shorter. Then his explanations began to contradict themselves. At one point, he claimed he had driven toward the river simply to take a break from work. A short while later, he changed his statement and said he had gone there to meet a friend. But when detectives asked him to provide the friend's name and contact information, he hesitated. The room fell quiet. Experienced investigators knew this moment well. It was the moment when a suspect realized that the story they had constructed was no longer strong enough to hold. Tang Tao sat in silence for several seconds, staring down at the table in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to steady his breathing. Finally, he lifted his head and spoke again. This time, the story was different. In a low voice, Tang Tao admitted that Wu Quan had not left the apartment that night. She had died there. According to his confession, the events of March 17th began with what seemed like an ordinary conversation. Wu Quan had come back to his apartment that evening after being away for several days. At first, nothing seemed unusual. They spoke casually about daily life and the upcoming birth of the child. But during the conversation, Tang Tao noticed something that made him uneasy. Wu Quan appeared distracted, constantly checking her phone. Messages kept arriving, and she seemed eager to respond immediately. When Tang Tao asked who she was talking to, she avoided giving a clear answer. The tension slowly began to rise. At first, Tang Tao said he simply felt curious, but curiosity soon turned into suspicion. Over the past few weeks, he had already begun noticing small changes in Wu Quan's behavior. She was spending more time away from home. Sometimes she disappeared for a day or two without explanation. That night, his suspicion finally pushed him to confront her. He asked directly whether she was seeing another man. According to Tang Tao, Wu Quan didn't deny it. Instead, she told him the truth. She had recently married someone else. The words hit him like a shock. For a moment, he couldn't even process what he had just heard. Married? The woman he believed was carrying his child, living in his apartment and preparing to start a family with him, had secretly married another man just days earlier. The argument that followed quickly spiraled out of control. Tang Tao described the conversation turning into shouting, accusations, and anger from both sides. He demanded to know how long she had been lying to him. Wu Quan reportedly responded with indifference, telling him that their relationship was already over. What happened next unfolded in only a few seconds. Overcome by rage, Tang Tao grabbed a fruit knife from the table. At first, he claimed he only intended to threaten her, to force her to stay and explain everything. But as the argument escalated, the situation slipped beyond his control. In a burst of anger, he lunged forward. The knife struck Wu Quan in the chest. Once, then again. Tang Tao told investigators that after the first attack, everything became a blur. He remembered Wu Quan collapsing onto the floor, blood spreading across the tiles. The room fell silent except for his own breathing. Only then did the reality begin to sink in. The woman he had just attacked was 7 months pregnant. Panic replaced anger almost instantly. Instead of calling for help, Tang Tao began thinking about how to hide what had happened. He realized that if the police discovered the truth, he would face severe punishment. The fear of being arrested quickly took control of his decisions. He began planning how to dispose of the body. Inside a storage room, he found an empty orange fertilizer sack. He wrapped Wu Quan's body inside it and tied the opening tightly with rope. But he knew that simply abandoning the body somewhere might lead to a quick discovery, so he searched for something heavy. Eventually, he found a concrete brick with 2 hollow holes through its center. By threading rope through the holes and securing it around the sack, he created a weight designed to pull the body beneath the water. Late that night, Tang Tao carried the sack down to his taxi. The streets were quiet as he drove toward the outskirts of Tongren. He chose a remote stretch of the Tuanjiang River where few people passed during the night. After parking near the riverbank, he dragged the heavy sack toward the water. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he pushed it into the river. The current quickly carried it away into the darkness. Tang Tao believed that once the body sank beneath the water, the truth would disappear with it. With the weight attached, he assumed it would never rise back to the surface. For nearly 2 weeks, he believed the plan had worked. But the river had slowly carried the body downstream, and as decomposition gases built up inside the sack, the weight was no longer enough to keep it submerged. Eventually, it surfaced. On the morning of April 2nd, a ferryman noticed what he first believed was a floating piece of trash. Instead, it was the beginning of a murder investigation. And now, sitting inside the interrogation room, Tang Tao had finally admitted to everything. The confession closed the final gap in the timeline of Wu Quan's death. But for investigators, the case still held one more tragic detail that would soon emerge during the forensic examination. With Tang Tao's confession recorded, investigators finally had a clear understanding of what had happened on the night of March 17th. The violent argument inside his apartment, the sudden attack with the knife, and the desperate attempt to hide the crime had all been confirmed. The pieces of the investigation that had once seemed scattered now formed a complete and tragic sequence of events. But even after the confession, one part of the case still required careful examination: the unborn child. During the autopsy conducted by forensic specialists, the condition of Wu Quan's body was studied in detail. The medical team documented multiple stab wounds to the chest and upper body, injuries that were consistent with Tang Tao's description of the attack. These wounds were determined to be the direct cause of her death. However, because Wu Quan had been approximately 7 months pregnant, investigators also needed to determine what had happened to the fetus. Forensic examiners confirmed that the unborn child had already reached a late stage of development. At 7 months, the fetus had formed identifiable features and had already turned into the head-down position typical in the final months before birth. Under different circumstances, the child would likely have been capable of surviving outside the womb with medical support. But inside the apartment that night, no help had ever come. The medical report concluded that the fetus died shortly after the mother's fatal injuries. Without circulation from the mother's body, the unborn child could not survive. The result was a tragedy that investigators described as the loss of 2 lives at once. The discovery added another layer of emotional weight to the case. For Tang Tao, the realization of what he had done gradually began to sink in during the days following his arrest. At first, his statements focused mostly on anger and betrayal. He described feeling humiliated after learning that Wu Quan had secretly married another man while continuing to live with him. But as the investigation continued, the tone of his statements changed. During later interviews, Tang Tao admitted that he had once believed the child Wu Quan carried was his. In the months leading up to the attack, he had been preparing for the baby's arrival. He had even spoken with relatives about becoming a father and discussed plans for raising the child. Those expectations had made the revelation of Wu Quan's marriage even more devastating to him. Yet investigators also pointed out that anger alone did not explain the actions that followed. After the attack, Tang Tao had made a series of deliberate choices. He had wrapped the body inside a sack, tied it with rope, attached a concrete brick, transported it by taxi, and thrown it into the river. Each step showed a clear attempt to hide the crime. In other words, the killing might have begun in a moment of uncontrolled rage, but everything that happened afterward was calculated. As the legal process moved forward, Tang Tao was formally charged with intentional homicide. Under Chinese criminal law, the deliberate killing of another person, especially with the use of a weapon, constitutes one of the most serious offenses. During the court proceedings, prosecutors reconstructed the entire sequence of events using the evidence gathered during the investigation. The timeline of phone calls, the surveillance footage from the apartment building, the GPS data from Tang Tao's taxi, and his own confession all aligned with the forensic findings. The court concluded that the evidence clearly established his responsibility for Wu Quan's death. The story of Wu Quan herself, however, remained complicated. Her life had been marked by instability, broken relationships, and decisions that often placed her in difficult situations. By maintaining multiple relationships at the same time and hiding the truth from the people around her, she had created a fragile web of deception that eventually collapsed. But none of those circumstances justified the violence that ended her life. In the end, the quiet river outside Tongren had exposed a crime that someone had believed would never be discovered. The orange fertilizer sack, the rope, and the concrete brick had all been part of an attempt to erase the evidence. Yet the current carried the truth back to the surface. What began as a strange object floating in the river became the starting point of an investigation that uncovered betrayal, anger, and a moment of violence that destroyed several lives at once. For the ferryman who first noticed the drifting object that morning, it had seemed like nothing more than a piece of trash moving with the current. Instead, it was the final clue in a story that someone had tried to bury beneath the water.